Yeah, there he is. So I just want to begin in the spirit of respect and reciprocity and truth, that we honor and that we acknowledge the lands and oral practices of the Treaty 7 Nations, the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani Nations, as well as the Ayaksi, Nakota, and Tsuut'ina Nations, on whose traditional lands that we are gathered this evening. We also ask that you consider the countless beings with whom we share this beautiful landscape and the web of life that provides us with clean air, water, food, and healthy bodies and minds. My name is Amarin. I know pretty much all of you here this evening. I'm going to get us started, and Dave, of course, is presenting this evening, so I'll introduce him shortly. So a little bit about Experience Journeys and who we are and what we're up to. We're a not-for-profit company with a mission of providing transformative experiences of awareness and connection to the landscapes and natural systems that sustain us. We offer nature therapy walks, citizen science, and environmental action projects and workshops, seminars, and youth education programs. So who are we? Our team is myself, Amarin. So probably first I will just explain or describe myself as environmental and animal activist, yoga and mindfulness guide, and a few other certifications, no need to list those. Also on our team is Lauren Shea. Lauren was born and raised here in Bray Creek, and she has the big task and job of keeping us organized here and caught up on technology. She's not with us tonight, so we're going to bumble around on her own. And she has a master's in tourism management. Other key members in our team are Courtney Lawson, who's with Baron Fox. She does all our website design. She's also involved in our youth programs with art. And Lisa Dolside, who is our educator and biologist. So a little more about tonight and what Learn Your Landscape is, in case this is your first time you've participated with us. We offer a series of expert presentations and discussion sessions on the landscapes and ecosystems of the foothills, mountains, and prairies that cradle our homes. Each session aims to present facts and raise questions regarding our landscapes and our ecosystems. These 60-minute presentations are followed by 30-minute discussion periods that aim to identify ways we can individually and collectively support and mitigate the issues raised. Proceeds from ticket sales are primarily meant to support environmental organizations of the speaker's choice, with lesser amount covering the costs of production. Learn Your Landscapes to date has forwarded funds in the amount of $5,250 to varying ENGOs, including Livingston Landowners Group, CPAWS, EcoJustice, and more. Over this next year, we've lined up over 15 presentations on topics as diverse as fungi, birds, the river, pollinators, narratives of connection, low carbon energy, and environmental policy. And many of these will be followed up with call to action field trips. We hope you learn with us and we inspire you to protect what you love. So on to tonight's event, our relationship with the Elbow River, Time for Therapy, as you know, is presented with Dave Klepacki. So a little bit about Dave, maybe some things that you don't know. Dave Klepacki spent his childhood learning the names of plants, animals, birds, and rocks in the Appalachian Mountains of New England and the Maritimes. He finished his formal studies with a PhD in geological sciences from MIT, mapping rock structures along the Kootenay Arc of British Columbia. Dave was able to travel the globe during a 35-year career as a geophysicist and executive in the oil and gas industry and published 26 papers of geological interest. He visited diverse landscapes and developed an interest in the global environment, resource consumption, and sustainability. Dave has resided in Bray Creek for over 30 years, raising a blended family of 6 with me, with a love for the outdoor adventures. Together, Dave and I have been active in supporting many community groups. Dave has a deep connection to the Elbow River as an amateur naturalist, fly fisherman, and longtime member of Trout Unlimited, an Alberta River Watershed Partnership Director, and a founding member of Stand for the Upper Elbow. He has written several recent editorials and has been interviewed on television and radio regarding preserving this important river valley and drinking water source for both wildlife and watershed residents, especially 600,000 some Canadians. So I am going to unmute you, Dave, to make sure we get that covered. I'll make sure you can unmute yourself and we'll let you take it away.
Thanks very much. Thank you all for being here tonight. And, as usual, for those of you who have seen my talks before, I've got a lot of ground to cover, and I'm going to try and cover them in a short time. I don't intend to go deeply into each one of these topics here. We can do that in the discussion. But as you probably know, many of the things we're going to cover would require a whole evening in themselves, if not more. Okay, so here we go. Here we go. Hi, Barbara. Can you tell me, how long have you been living near the river?
Well, I grew up near the river. All my childhood was spent here. And now most of my adult life I've lived beside the river.
So how many years would that be? 20?
Almost 80.
Well, that's good. You're doing really well. Okay. Secondly, how long do you think the river, or how do you think the river has shaped your life?
Oh, well, we depended on the river. Years ago, of course, it was our drinking water. We had to keep a hole open even in the winter to come down and get fresh drinking water. And we sort of guided our activities by what the river was doing. For example, in the summer we swam in it and we collected minnows, and in the winter we cut ice out of it for the ice cooler, and skated. And in the spring we watched it very carefully to see if it was flooding or not.
Can I ask you where you cut the ice out of it? Was it close by where we're standing here? Or?
No, actually. More often we cut, I don't know exactly where in the river, more often we cut it out of Bragg Creek.
Oh, okay.
Up by Flugers?
Yeah, so, okay, yeah, just right over there.
Yeah.
Okay, and Barbara, can you tell me, how do you feel about the river now?
Well, the river has certainly declined in volume during my lifetime, and it certainly isn't as pristine as it used to be. I don't ever remember slimy rocks in the river when I was young, at least. In fact, even up until about maybe the 80s or 90s, do I remember slimy rocks. So it's definitely a concern to take care of the river.
Can you tell me how you might feel about the berm that we are standing along right now, and what do you think about that?
Well, the berm is not going to control our groundwater by any stretch of imagination, so I feel that the berm is really overdone for the amount of protection that it's going to give us, because we are on, of course, the river aquifer, and the berm, by perhaps speeding the water up, narrowing the channel, speeding the water up, making the water level higher, is going to create more groundwater for us.
Thank you so much. I hope we never have to experience that, but it's hard to say with these changing times. Thank you so much, Barbara. Okay, Jason, can you tell me how many years you've been involved with the Elbow River?
Yes. Well, I moved here from Chestermere with my family when I was 3, so that makes it 13 years. I'm 16 now.
Okay, well, that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think the river has affected you in your life here?
Well, it's been huge growing up by the river. and there's all those unique opportunities you get, like just the fun activities you get to do in the day, like rafting, or even little things like catching bugs. There's always the imminent danger, I guess, of the flood. Floods do happen often, or so I've heard. I've only lived here for that long, and there's been one big one. But other than that, no, it's been incredible. I'm glad I got the opportunity to live by a big river like that.
Well, that's great. That's a wonderful answer. Can you tell me how you feel about the river now? Because I know that you live very close to the river right now.
Well, I do always appreciate living by the river, even at this age. As I'm starting to branch out in different places, I still love living by the river. A couple things that are happening. There's a lot of construction lately, and it's very loud. All in preparation for the next flood to not cause further property damage, which is okay. I am totally all for that, but there's a lot of construction, which kind of sucks. But other than that, no, it's been beautiful. It's been great. I'm glad.
So you're kind of the spirit that you're willing to put up with all of the construction and the hassle of that for the sake of the flood protection.
Well, it is a tragedy with all the obviously the ecosystem that involves the river is a huge part of the ecosystem here in Bragg, and all the construction vehicles and the noise pollution and the light pollution with those huge lights, especially the I see a lot usually because of the machines like the excavators and the loaders. So it is hard to put up with it because seeing like less and less of what I love from when I was a kid, it's hard to see it go away. But I also do appreciate not having 10 feet of water in my basement. So I guess it's for a cause.
Okay. Thanks very much, Jason. Appreciate that.
No problem.
I love the river because it feels good. In the summer, I find rocks in the river. I like the trees around the river. It makes me feel happy. I like the sound of the water hitting, crashing on the rocks. I like the color of the river. It feels peaceful.
Well, okay, so let's, after those interviews of these Bragg Creek and Redwood Meadows residents, let's go in and cover the topics. And as you know, the topic tonight is our relationship with the Elbow River. And as you'll see, there's quite a few issues that we have to deal with, and maybe it's time to really think about dealing instead of just laying one on top of another, so that in the future, like these pictures here that you see, the river will still have an environment that's pristine enough to support these lives, these upcoming lives. What I'm going to talk about tonight is the first section is going to be about the river geography and dynamics. And then there's a middle section that talks a bit about the wildlife and trout and inhabitants of the watershed. And then the bulk of the talk is on land use and some of the issues that are threatening the integrity of the river ecosystem. And then finally, we'll talk about some ideas about preserving the river enough so that it continues to be an ecosystem that works for itself and still provides the essential services that we need from the river, including all of the health and the mental health and physical services like recreation that we all love this river. Well, first off, it's actually, the Elbow River is actually a pretty small segment of the much larger Bow watershed. It's about, as you can see, 12,000 square kilometers. It's 121 kilometers long from Elbow Lake down to where it flows into the Bow in Calgary. Has pretty steep grade 1,670 meter elevation drop, which is a 1% grade. And that's actually much steeper than other rivers, which are tenths of a percent of a grade, like the Bow River. The average flow is about 300 billion liters per year. And the City of Calgary Glenmore water treatment plant uses about 200 million liters per day. When you look at the total flow of the Elbow River, which is 71 billion liters per year, the drinking water or the water consumption from Glenmore takes about 24% of the flow. I should say they just upgraded the Glenmore capacity to 400 million cubic liters per day. So it has the potential to take about half of the flow of the river. As it currently stands with Calgary's population of about 1.5 million, a little bit over that, 632,000 Calgarians rely upon the Elbow River for drinking water. Not to mention all of us in Bragg Creek, Redwood Meadows, parts of Springbank, all of the people upstream from Calgary who also rely on it, and of course, all of our wildlife needs that require the river to live. And by part of a larger system, that little red line on the left-hand side of this image, that's the Elbow River. The water from Elbow Lake, which flows by Bragg Creek and Redwood and Calgary, ends up in Hudson's Bay by going through the South Saskatchewan River into the Saskatchewan River itself, and then through Lake Winnipeg and into the Nelson. So it's a long ways, but those drops of water, if they make it through somebody's system in Calgary, they'll end up in Hudson's Bay. So let's go back. What do we know about the river's history? Well, not much before the last glaciation, which started about 250,000 years ago, and finally started receding about 15,000 years ago. You can see that image on the right shows actually the Calgary lies right in the middle of the suture between the two major ice sheets, the Laurentide ice sheet, which came from Hudson's Bay, and the Cordilleran ice sheet, which came from the Rocky Mountains. The image on the left is about 3,500 years ago when the melting started and these two ice sheets started to retreat. And a lot of our landscapes around here are shaped by Glacial Lake Calgary. You can see on the image, it shows Highway 1 going through the middle. I want to point that out. There's Highway 1, there's the town of Cochrane, here's Camp Gardner. This is the Elbow River right here. And since the glaciation, the Elbow, of course, has become clear. But the Glacial Lake Calgary was dammed by the huge retreating ice. And then there was also Glacial Lake Pritis, which was to the south here. And the Bragg Creek, the West Bragg Sutina pit was a connection between Lake Calgary and Lake Pritis. Many of you have probably been lucky enough to get up to the source of the Elbow River, which is Elbow Lake, but in all honesty, that's really not the source. The source is up here in this little valley by the retreating Ray Glacier, which probably in our lifetimes will be gone. But here is the Elbow River after the outlet of Elbow Lake, and you can straddle that if you're tall enough. There's kind of three regions that many of you know about, and this shot from Springbank shows them crystal clearly. There's the plains or the prairies in front, and then there's the foothills, the forested foothills, and then finally the Rocky Mountains in the background. And they certainly play a role in the river. And the reason why they play a role is this: the geology underneath the river has caused those three different geomorphic provinces. The plains down where Springbank is, see right here, they're underlain by flat-lying rock. Then the fold and thrust belt, which is composed of sheets of rock stacked one on top of another, comprises the foothills. This is the Moose Mountain Dome on the left-hand side. And then finally, the high Rocky Mountains start right by Nahahi Ridge and then continue, of course, to the west. But this geological differences is what makes those physiographic differences that we see. And it has an effect on the Elbow River. The gradient up in the Rocky Mountains is quite steep. It's 1.9%. In the foothills, it's about 0.9%, about half of what it was in the Rockies. And then down on the prairies, it's much flatter, about a third of what it was in the foothills. And these different physiographic regions play another role. And that's where most of the river comes from. You can see this is called a hydrograph. And this shows what the flows are over the time of the year. And you can see most of the water measured in black here comes from above Elbow Falls in the Rocky Mountains. And then the foothills adds this amount of water, and then finally the plains adds the smallest amount of water. And the final point, and which we'll talk about in much greater detail, is only about 10 to 30% of the water that's in the Elbow River watershed flows as surface water, as the Elbow River itself or the tributaries that flow, the creeks and streams that flow into it. Here's another graph that shows this kind of this same concept, that most of the water in the Elbow River, you can see where it's steep right here, comes from the headwaters region. And by the time you get out to the prairie, there's almost no addition to the discharge of the Elbow River. So not only does water move down the Elbow River, but a great deal of sediment, sand and gravel and cobbles also move down the Elbow River. Here's a shot right up by the trading post in Bragg Creek Provincial Park. This is the shot before the 2013 flood, and you can see these tight meanders. And then after the flood, where those meanders became much longer wavelength because of the sediment load that was deposited during the 2013 flood. This shot is right by Redwood Meadows, and you can see the same thing, the meandering nature of the river along the alluvial plain before the flood, and then after the flood, same much longer wavelength channel. So the sediment is moving through these, especially in the flood events. This is the Glenmore Reservoir. The Glenmore Reservoir has lost more than 15% of its capacity from the sediment that has come from the upper reaches of the Elbow River and been deposited in the reservoir, right in the Weasel Head area. So eventually, in about 200 years or so, the Glenmore Reservoir will be entirely filled with sediment. So this wide plain that we saw in the previous pictures where the river meanders back and forth across, that's called the alluvial aquifer. The river itself flows in part of that, but a lot of groundwater, as Barb had alluded to in the first part, in the video part of the introduction of this talk, a lot of the water, somewhere between 80 and 90% actually, is in the gravels that surround the river. That's an important point that we'll come back to later on in the talk. How about the temperatures of the river? Well, here's some temperatures that were taken over the course of a few years near the Highway 22 bridge. And you can see the warmest it gets is about 15 degrees C. And when we go swimming in it, it's usually more in the 10 degree range. You can see this is October, this is July, so this is the time we go swimming in the river. Interestingly enough, when you get above 19 degrees, your cutthroat trout will die because of the heat. When you get above 21 degrees, bull trout will die because of the heat. So the river may be cold for us for swimming, but it is absolutely perfect for the native bull and cutthroat trout that live here. And by the way, those are the only trout that are indigenous to the Elbow River. The rainbows, the browns, and the brook trout are all introduced species. So next few slides are a little bit about the water quality of the river. And what this shows is that as you go downstream from Cobble Flats and up by Little Elbow Campground, you can see the temperature increasing as you go downstream. Here was Highway 22 bridge where we saw the temperature readings before. And the total suspended solids, TSS as the river quality people like to talk about, is also increasing. The conductivity, which is in part related to chlorides in the water, is increasing as you go downstream. The pH is actually decreasing until you get right to the end. It's because the limestone in the mountain is becoming neutralized as you go downstream. So in general, the water quality deteriorates as you go downstream. And it also has been getting, as Barb had alluded to before, it's getting worse over time. You can see since the 80s to the present day, the slopes on these graphs of chloride and nitrate and nitrite nutrients and total organic carbon, sorry, they're all increasing over the years. And especially the coliform count. The before and after, actually, this was done in 2018. The before and after is actually Elbow Spring. This part of this was to see what the effect of the Elbow Springs development had on the river quality. Let's talk about climate next. So as we'll be talking, a lot of flooding and droughts is related to the climate effects. The two biggest ones that we have that control our climate here in Western Canada are called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which operates on the wavelength of about a decade, 15 years. And the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which many of you have made the headlines more often. And that operates on about a year to a couple of years. There's actually another one called the Arctic Oscillation, which we experienced this winter. That's the one that gives us the polar vortex, or polar vortices, and that operates on a few months. So what happens is all of these different climate effects layer on top of one another. And when they all come in their wet phases for us, those are the years that bring floods. And when they layer on top of each other in their dry phases, that's when we get the really big forest fires. The 2016, 2017 was a dry phase where the PDO and ENSO were both in their dry phases for us. On top on top of these atmospheric oscillations, we can see the temperature is rising. There's no question about that. We all know that. So you have to superpose these climate effects on an increasing temperature. So what does that mean for us in the future? Well, the future is going to have our spring freshets or floods are going to be decreased, and they're going to occur earlier in the spring. And our summer flows are going to get lower, and summer flows will occur earlier in the year. So here's a group of from the University of Calgary who calculated exactly, or using their climate models, what will happen as we go in the future. This is the total precipitation in centimeters, and the difference that's going to happen. So again, you can see the movement of the peak to earlier in the year and then lower summer flow. Let's talk a bit more about the weather. So what happened last year, and actually happened in 2013 and happens every few years for us? Well, it's when you get one of these high pressure systems over the Canadian Arctic that block the movement of low pressure systems coming west off the Pacific or northeastward off of the southern United States. What happened then is these two lows combine underneath this high, and they bring a counterclockwise current of moisture off the Gulf of Mexico, which hits the front ranges and creates what's called upslope precipitation. Mountains act like a dam, and it dumps all of the water here in the foothills. And that's exactly what happened to us in 2013, and to a lesser degree even last year. Why is this important? Well, this is actually, I just downloaded this yesterday. This is the snow pillow from the Little Elbow Summit automated weather station up by Elbow Lake. And you can see where we are right now. We're a little bit above normal. This is the range of normal. And we're going to continue up. The snowpack will increase usually till about the middle of April and some of those big April snowstorms. And then suddenly with the warm sun, it's going to decrease. This right here is the critical time. The question is, when we get those rains, how much snow is on the ground? What is the air temperature? And does that bring both the snow and rain down upon us, or just the rain itself? Is what happened in 2005. Let's talk about flooding, because that's what happens often when we get the rain on top of the snow as it's melting. Here's a picture of Dick Crustier's house going underneath the bridge in 2013, and then down in Elbow Park in Calgary. So there's a bit of a controversy now over what's called the return rate, or the flood frequency, how often, whether a flood is a 1 to 100 year flood, or 1 to 200, or 1 to 2000. There's an issue with this in that because we didn't have really good observations back in the late 1800s, we actually exclude the largest floods that have occurred in the Elbow River Basin from those statistical calculations. And in my view, that's a big mistake. By the way, this is a picture of the 1897 flood in Calgary, which along with the 1879 flood, these two were about equal in magnitude. They're by far the worst floods that have ever occurred in the Elbow River and Bow River watersheds. Here's some calculations that I had made based on a ratio between the Elbow River flow and the Bow River flow, even before the dams were placed along the Bow River. And if you include, which I did, the 1879, 1897, and 1902 floods, in your calculations, you find that the 2013 flood is basically about a 1 in 40 to 1 in 50 year flood, and not a 1 to 200 or even 1 to 100 flood. It's actually much more frequent. And why is it important to include those statistics when we want to consider the flood frequency here in the Elbow River watershed? Well, it goes back to the climate issues that we talked before. When you have the Pacific Decadal Oscillation and the El Nino Southern Oscillation, what's called positively reinforcing each other, those are wet years. And here you can see from 1875 to 1902, we had some of the wettest years on record. These are measured from the wet and dry cycles measured from tree rig. And we can see here that it's very wet. So that's why we had 3 of the worst floods that have occurred in the area there. 2013, of course, here. What about drought? Here is 2017, which many of you remember as a drought year. And Amarin and I, in August, walked across the Big Elbow River, and there was no river in the Big Elbow River. It was all flow, any water was flowing down in the alluvial aquifer, as you can see here. The other interesting fact is that when you plot the high flows and the low flows for the Elbow River since 1930, and you run a simple statistical regression through them, you see that the slopes are negative. And they're negative to the point where we're losing about 20% of the river flow every 100 years. So as we go forward, that's kind of ominous. We don't really know why, but most hydrologists and climatologists think it's because of the increased evaporation and transpiration from the trees with the warming temperature from climate change. Well, let's move on and talk about some of the inhabitants that rely on these diminishing flows of the Elbow River. How about the bull trout, which are a threatened species? So here it shows, this is a graph that shows where the bull trout, the historic range of the bull trout, and the ranges where they're potentially risky farther to the north, and especially in our area where the bull trout are at high range, at high risk, or have been extirpated, which means they no longer live in the river. You can see from this 2006 study, most of the bull trout lived in the middle stretch, in the foothills stretch of the Elbow River, and they still do. Some of us have caught trout just like this one up here in the 20-inch range, right here in Bragg Creek. But it's all catch and release. These species are threatened, and we feel we should do our best to preserve these. These are the proverbial canary in the coal mine for the health of the river. West Slope cutthroat trout are pretty much in the same boat as the bull trout are. These are, again, one of our 2 indigenous species of trout. Here was their historic range, and this is it for genetically pure West Slope cutthroat trout. Many of the cuts that are within the Elbow River have hybridized with the rainbow trout, so they're no longer pure cutthroat trout. You can see here in the Elbow River, the 2 areas where they are still, where pure, genetically pure cutthroat trout still exist are in the upper parts of the Prairie Creek and the lower parts of Sylvester. I'll talk a little bit about Sylvester Creek because unfortunately it looks like that population may be now extirpated. And then actually most of the biomass in our river is actually not fish. Most of the biomass are these bugs, these aquatic invertebrates that many of you see here in the summertime. Here's the mayflies in the upper left, and then there's the stoneflies down in the lower left, and the caddisflies up here in the upper right, and then what are called diptera or true flies here on the right hand side. Crane fly, and I'm having a middle-aged moment. I forgot the name of the lower fly. But one of the things I wanted to point out on this lower graph is you can see the mayflies and the stoneflies in particular are signs of a healthy ecosystem. And you can see that in the upper parts of the Elbow River, the mayflies and stoneflies are still very healthy, thriving components of the macroinvertebrate population that live there. When you get down into the city, unfortunately, the water quality has declined and the mayflies and stoneflies are a much lower percentage of the aquatic invertebrate population there. How about the animals that live along the Elbow River watershed? Well, here's Bragg Creek here, and you can see the Rockies off to the left. There's Redwood Meadows and then Springbank right here. The area I've outlined in red is the area where grizzly sightings are common. And the area that's outlined in orange are where the jumping pound elk herd frequents. Many of you see them when you drive along Highway 22. Well, it turns out the rivers are good east-west highways or southwest to northeast highways for the movement of these critters, especially these grizzly bears, which are actually located right here, right just south of SR1, just right off the highway back in 2016. The other interesting feature here is you can see this forested region in the foothills, and you can see the green line that separates the montane forest subregion from the foothills parkland subregion. There actually isn't very much pristine foothills parkland left, and especially foothills parkland that has grizzly bears and a thriving jumping pound elk herd. And the reason why the grizzly bears are there are in large part because of the elk. Matter of fact, this mama grizz and her two cubs are feeding off of an elk hill right by Highway 22. So we live in a very important wildlife corridor, and actually intersection of wildlife corridors. And if we want to keep, we have to be very careful as we go forward if we want to keep our wildlife neighbors healthy and in a very significant and healthy population. Okay, let's talk about some of the land use along the Elbow watershed. And actually, this is us hiking up by Canyon Creek in one of the tributaries of Canyon Creek in Canada. And of course, you know, in the summertime, there's lots and lots of hikers and recreationalists, mountain bikers, people who use off-highway vehicles, lots of recreationalists in the Elbow River watershed. As a matter of fact, there's a concern that we're loving our headwaters to death. I got the traffic count numbers for Highway 66 and the Bragg Creek Road, and I've posted them here. I'll start off on the bottom. You can see in 2019, the 2020 numbers aren't out yet, there was about 1.3 million people that visited the Elbow Falls, Prairie Mountain area and west of there, based on the traffic cables, the traffic counter cables that went across the road there. So the interesting thing about this number is this is likely much higher by probably another 300,000, 400,000 people. Because as you can see from the other two numbers, the rise has been about 30 to 40% increase. The people who visited the Fullerton Loop area went from 81,000, almost 82,000, up to about 105,000 people last year. The West Bragg Trails, as many of us in Bragg Creek know, has virtually exploded in its popularity. In 2019, there was 192,000 visits in that year, and it went up by 40% to 253,000 people. Sorry, in 2019, went up by 40% to last year, 2020. And as we know here in January, that trend is continuing. So there's a lot of visitation and a lot of people out in the woods. And of course, what does that do to the movement of the bears and the moose and the elk that are out there? How about logging? This is from an area called Mustang Hills, right by Rainy Summit. And you can see some radical environmentalists out there saying something about the clear cutting and Kananaskis. I like to calculate things. One of the calculations that I made was, I looked at this old 1984 Google image of the Elbow River, and I also looked at this 2016 image of the Elbow River area. And I just counted the number of cut areas versus in 2016 from 1984. And what I saw is that I didn't count, like, for instance, the Moose Mountain, can't cut trees up there, or Prairie, or Powderface Ridge, or Prairie Mountain. I tried to stick to some of just the forested areas, although I probably overestimated the amount of forested areas because of the meadows that are down there, or the places that are just too steep to cut, even in the foothills. But nevertheless, I went ahead and did my point count. And what I found was that 24%, again, is probably a conservative number, of the harvestable forest has been logged in 31 years. And that is a deforestation rate of a little bit less than 1% a year. Percent, close to what it is, if not a little bit higher. To compare those numbers to deforestation rates elsewhere in general, the world in the 2001 to 2019 time period, the deforestation rate for the world was 6%. For all of Canada, it was 10%, but for our Elbow River drainage, it was 14%. So one of the things that this mosaic of forest cuts does is it doesn't allow the connectivity of critical habitat for animals to be able to move back and forth between places that are most suitable for them to eat or to eat other animals. So that's a bit of an issue. And how it affects the groundwater, we don't really know either. Well, we know a bit about it, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about that later. One of the main things that clear cutting as a method of forest harvesting does is it tends to cut, well, it doesn't tend, it does. It cuts all of the old growth forests out, because of course those are the biggest trees with the most timber and are valuable for logging and fiber. What happens is if you keep on cutting out the older trees, what you end up with is a much younger forest than a natural forest for the Alberta foothills, which includes trees from 0 to trees that are almost 400 years old. This particular graph is from a place in Finland where they practice clear cutting, and you can see what's happened to their forest over here. The number of old growth forests with what we call mother trees, the trees that connect with all of the other trees through the fungal wood wide web, as they call it, they're decreasing as a percent of the population. And that is likely not a very good thing for a healthy foothills ecosystem. Many of you have traveled through McLean, the McLean Creek off-highway vehicle land use zone, and along with Cypress. These are play spaces that are out in the foothills that meet the need of a significant portion of the people of Alberta. It's about, I guess, somewhere between 5 and 10% of the people who actually have quads or motorcycles that use this area. However, it's all good fun, but there are some significant downsides that occur to the ecosystem in here. And our decision has been, well, we're happy to kind of throw this zone of our foothills we're happy to live with the destruction or the degradation of this zone so we can have it for this form of outdoor recreation. Here you can see siltation that comes from the off-highway vehicles going through the stream beds. On the lower left-hand side is McLean Creek itself. Upper right-hand is a siltation event that occurred in 2018 in Sylvester Creek that I actually discovered with a friend of mine. And that's the event that likely extirpated the genetically pure cutthroat trout that were in that stream. The silt occurred just about their spawning time, just before they were spawning. And the eggs can't live in water that's highly silted like that. And this final, in the lower right-hand side, is Fish Creek, the very headwaters of Fish Creek, which isn't in the Elbow River watershed, but nonetheless, you can see it. It suffers the same kind of siltation. So a guy did a study, Lauren Boyer did a study in McLean Creek, and he used different methods to calculate how much silt actually went into the Elbow River. And he figured it was between about 12 tons and 14 tons in the span of a year. Sorry, not even a year. No, in the span of the summer, in the summer months. So that's a lot of silt going into the streams and then down into the Elbow. So grazing is another issue. In the earlier days when the Elbow River watershed was not used so much for hiking and mountain biking and all of the kinds of recreation that we do, it was put to what was thought to be good use by being able to run your cattle up there, your beef cattle up there in the summertime. However, now there's becoming conflicts as more people are recreating up there and as the water becomes more scarce and impure commodity. So what happens? Well, I was involved with Ralph Carter in supervising some St. Mary's University students to try and quantify what the effect of cows are on these creeks. And here are the sampling sites that we did from up on the slopes of Moose Mountain down to Hawkeye Estates, which are in part of West Bragg, just outside Kananaskis. And you can see what you might have expected to see. That turbidity and chloride, the nutrient nitrogen and phosphorus are all very positively correlated with cow poo, rather than using other descriptions of those species. But the cows here do have a very significant effect on the water quality. Now, Cows and Fish actually is working very hard to figure out ways like off-stream watering and different fencing systems where cows along the creeks do not create so much damage. But nonetheless, in the trails area, they do seem to do a significant damage, not only to water quality, but to the trails themselves. Well, this is a map dealing with wildfire. As it turns out, as of 2019, Bragg Creek and Whitecourt had the highest risk of a wildfire disaster, like what happened at Fort Mac or Slave Lake in earlier years. So this continues to be a big concern for those of us who choose to live in the forest or near them. Many of you remember the Champion Lakes wildfire, which got started in a slash pile from a off-highway vehicle that had parked there, and the exhaust had started the slash on fire. Wildfires are a big concern to anybody who uses the water system, especially if we want to drink the water system. And that's not just us people. It includes all of the animals, the fish, the invertebrates. It increases the turbidity in some cases to almost an opaque level. It hugely increases total organic carbon, which creates a big drain on any dissolved oxygen that's in the water. It promotes algal growth from the nutrients from the forest fire. Toxic metals are released from the ash, including methyl mercurate. And there's a huge increase, more than doubling, in the cost of treating water that has been contaminated by forest fires. Okay, now I want to talk about some of the land use that's in the lower part of the Elbow River watershed in Springbank and in Calgary. But actually, first, I guess I'm gonna talk about berms, as Barb had alluded to. I feel badly about the berms here. There could have been other flood mitigation solutions where that I feel would have been better suited, such as an upstream dam where we wouldn't have to have berms. But because of flood mitigation in Calgary, I feel that those of us that live in Bragg Creek, we are trading our berms here for a culvert so that they don't have to have berms down in Calgary. I know that sounds a bit bitter, but yes, I'm an old and bitter guy when it comes to separating me from this beautiful river. Yeah, the shot below was, of course, before the berms were constructed. It was taken a few years ago, and here this was just taken last fall as the berms are being constructed. As Barb had alluded to, berms don't protect you from groundwater flooding. Groundwater flooding is the water that comes from the river, goes into the aquifer, and then comes up on the other side of the berm into people's basements, or perhaps if the water level was raised high enough, right up through the ground, such that there is the possibility of creating a pond behind the berm. How can I say that with conviction about groundwater flooding? Well, our good friends at the University of Calgary had the sense to go to Redwood Meadows immediately after the 2013 flood and ask people how much water they had in their basement, because Redwood Meadows is built on the aquifer. And it turns out you can go 300 meters south of the berm, away from the river, and you'll still have 60 centimeters of water, more than half a meter of water in your basement. That also happened in 2005 in the community of Rideau and Roxborough, where the 2005 elevated the flood level of the Elbow River downstream from the Glenmore Dam and flooded people's basements. Here on the lower right-hand side, you can see where the aquifer is in those communities of Britannia, Elbow Park, Roxborough, and Mission. Well, Springbank is facing some serious development decisions, some of which are shortly to be made. And that includes the building of the flood mitigation project, the Springbank Off-Stream Reservoir, and then a series of development subdivisions. You probably know Discovery Ridge is already present, Elbow Valley is already present, in some cases out on the aquifer. Elbow View is the name of a proposed subdivision west of Elbow Valley that ultimately over 20 years is going to have planned to have 7,000 housing units, housing 19,000 people. And the Gardner plan is resurrected west of that, which is for about 2,000 acreages, housing 6,000 people. So if you add these two, that's about 25,000 people, and there's about 7,500 people on top of that. So you have more than 32,000 people that will be living along the aquifer in the south part of Springbank. Now that doesn't include any development on the north side of the river. Looking at the Springbank Off-Stream Flood Control Project, one thing that's difficult to appreciate, at least for me, was the size of this area. So I went out to see just how large it actually looked. There's my truck, and I'm standing at the water line of a full reservoir for a 2013 style flood. And I'm looking across Upper Springbank, and up along this hill right over here would be where the shoreline is. And all of this area that's cut, which is home to the Jumping Pound elk herd now, would be underwater. Another one of the issues with the Springbank Off-Stream Reservoir project is that in a 2013 style flood, it'll hold not quite 77 million, but about 68 million cubic meters of warmed water. Remember that temperature graph that we saw at Highway 22, where it's 15 degrees in July? Well, this is July right here. And that warmed water will be discharged back over the months of July and August, back into the Elbow River at between 10 and 12 cubic meters per second, which essentially is double the average flow of the Elbow River. So you're essentially adding 2 Elbow rivers back into the Elbow River, downstream from there of warmed water. And of course, that will drastically disrupt the cold water ecosystem that exists there now. So again, development in itself is fine. I mean, we need to accommodate the population. I guess one of the things that several of us who have worked closely with the Elbow River are asking for is farther setbacks away from the Elbow River itself, having essentially a big, huge park along the aquifer and keeping houses about 1 kilometer away from the water. Why do I say 1 kilometer? Well, it actually is how far a virus can travel in gravel and porous sand before it dies. So if we're very concerned about viruses now, and as we should be, but it just seems to be very smart to keep the pollutants, both pathogenic pollutants and chemical toxins, out of the Elbow River. Since, as we know, right now, more than 600,000 people in Calgary rely on it. This suburban sprawl, as it extends into Rocky View, is something that those of you who are residents of Rocky View should be concerned about. I know I certainly am. So what does it look like? This is the Discovery Ridge neighborhood, and you can see all of these houses above Discovery Pond. And although in this oblique view, the pond looks really nice and inviting, when you look at it up close, this is actually this exact same day, right down at our feet, you can see that the pond waters are experiencing what is called eutrophication. The nutrients that are in that water are so high, the algae are just consuming them like crazy. And they're lessening the dissolved oxygen for the fish and any other creatures that live there. So basically, algae overruns the water, it's called an algal bloom. And you can see how close these houses are to the Elbow River. This is the river right here on the pathway towards Discovery Pond, which is just down here in the distance. There are some measurements that came from 2012 that, again, go back to this theme, is when you're close to the river and septic systems or fertilizer from lawns or oil from people's exhaust or make its way onto the aquifer and into the groundwater. You can see the nitrogen is increasing, phosphorus, chloride, and total dissolved solids, as we saw in the Discovery Pond case. And of course, one of the other things that has happened to the Elbow River is the ring road. Again, the trade-off of what we need to live in an ever-increasing population in Calgary, and what happens to the precious water that we equally need, or perhaps even more importantly need, to survive here in this ecological service. And you can see when they were building the bridges a couple of years ago, here is the sediment plume into the Glenmore Reservoir through the Weasel. They were building the ring road. Now, to be honest, the construction is done. So this kind of devastation to the Elbow River won't be occurring. There were some beavers and frogs and stuff like that whose ecosystem was destroyed, and they're gone now. But the main concern for the ring road on the west side is with the traffic going along there, you're going to be getting exhaust blowing from the west to the east into the Glenmore Reservoir, which is going to contribute to the heavy metals content of the Glenmore in the drinking water and increase costs to get that out. So pollution in the lower elbow, I mean, that's a concern too. And in my view, it would be great if we could do more to clean up the banks of the lower elbow and do more like fixing busted sewer pipes to increase the water quality that we see down. There's always been a mystery down by Sandy Beach, south of the Glenmore, or sorry, northeast, downstream from the Glenmore Dam, and that they have to close it down just about every year now in July. And that's because the fecal coliform, that's the bacteria from poop, from human poop, gets into the river water. And they know now that the reason why it gets into that water is because of what I had said just a few minutes ago. Sewer lines are busted in there and need repair, and the water leaks out, the sewage water leaks out into the river water. Now, it's not just carrying poop, but there's a lot of hormonal pollutants that are going in there too. You know, a lot of birth control flows right through your system and comes out in your urine, and those hormones end up going into the river water in the Elbow River, and they can cause things like deformities in amphibians, and also deformities are changes to the hormonal structure in trout. So what's happening in our need for a clear and clean Elbow River? Well, you can see that the demand for the water as Calgary's population grows is increasing. We're doing, as you can see, this blue line, even though it has a positive slope, is kind of flattened out a bit. That's because water conservation measures are kicking into place. But when you look at the growth curves, and now they have a better handle because we're at 2020, and the calculation is that we will exceed the water availability, the water license that the city of Calgary has by the year 2036. So something's going to have to give, or we're all going to have to work now to make the water, the ecosystem in the Elbow River sustainable and conserve what water we have if we want our children and grandchildren to continue to grow up and live in a beautiful area. So this is where the Elbow River flows into the Bow, down by the zoo, but this is not the end of the Elbow. What can we do? As Amron has taught me over the years, we protect what we love, and we shouldn't be afraid of our feelings for nature. We should actually embrace them, and that's what we need to do if we want to have the Elbow River continue to sustain us. We have to love it, and we have to nurture it. And of course, the most obvious thing to do is we need to become politically involved. We all need to become politically involved. We can't let someone else do it. Politicians, as David Swan always says, they respond to communication. They respond to writing. They respond to phone calls. They respond to people having protests or demonstrations of hopefully of a peaceful kind. So become politically involved. Become a pain in the neck for your politicians in terms of the environmental policy. Conserve water. That's a really important thing. If you've been raised like many of us were on a well, then you know it's precious, and you don't just leave the water running. You shut it off and you limit your water use. That's something we all need. And then finally, get outdoors and connect. You know, as we're doing, you know, again, the population. I mean, yes, we're loving the river to death, but if we go out there with a consciousness, with a connection, we don't just throw our trash in the river. We don't pee in them. We take care of the creatures. We don't disturb the creatures that live. We connect with this beautiful ecosystem, and we sustain it. One other thing we can do that's really important, and I would like to put it out there tonight and revive this discussion. In the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan back in July of 2014, they recognized all of these pressures on the Elbow River. And what they proposed is to create a provincial park entirely from Bragg Creek or the edge of the public land or the private land, sorry, all the way out to Little Elbow, to the upper part. Make that entire drainage into the Elbow River, the Elbow Valley Provincial Park. And in my view, that's what we really need to do as a good first step to maintaining the integrity of the Elbow River and allowing it to give us the ecological service.
So I'm not sure, is anybody still on? We might have lost a lot of people here. We have just lost our internet. Not a good sales pitch for Mage. So we're just going to see what we can do here. Can Can I just get anybody in the chat room just to make sure that they can hear me? Anyone just to chat out? Yeah, thanks, Ralph. Awesome. Okay, we're gonna run off my phone. I'm gonna get Dave to come in. Also awesome. I see we lost a few people, but I'm gonna go in the other room and grab Dave and we can go into the Q&A now. So we don't wanna lose you because this is actually one of the most engaging parts of our evening. So what I want to do though is just give you a couple minutes if you need to take a pee break, grab a glass of water or a glass of wine or a beer, and we're going to get started with the Q&A. We have Flora Giesbrook with us. I'd like to invite her to partake in a couple minutes. So take a little break. We'll try to get us going again here on our laptops. Otherwise, we'll run from my phone. So thanks everyone for your patience, and we'll just see you back in a couple minutes.
Yeah, hello.
Okay, so Dave's back up. I'm just going to run off my phone, but we're still going to give you a minute or two before we start. So here we go. Flora, if you want to, I'm not going to be able to open your video. If you want to open your video up, because I'm on my phone, I can't really see what's happening. I'm sitting in the kitchen here at the Heart. And we're going to do our best to pull up questions. Dave, can you pull up the Q&A on?
Yeah, you bet.
Awesome.
So
And we'll just give it a minute.
I think it's on chat. I think it looks to me like some of the things are on chat.
Yeah. So we're just going to get our act together here. I know none of you are strangers to to Wi-Fi issues if you live out in Bragg Creek, especially if you come to our yoga classes. We're constantly diving in and out of classes. I don't even get heart palpitations anymore. So we'll give everybody another minute or so and we'll get on to the Q&A. So again, type any questions and we're going to do our best to get to the questions.
Are you gonna come here, Cameron?
Nope, I'm gonna stay on here. I'm trying to get my laptop up too.
Geez, I showered today and everything.
Good. Can you see Flora there?
Yeah, I can see Flora.
Okay, awesome. All righty, there we go. I am here. There we go. It's got me in both places. I am going to leave this one. And over there.
Tell me when to go, because Renee has a question on the chat that we can talk about. Oops, you're muted. Let me go tell her. You're muted.
There we go. All right, I'm yapping on. Now I'm unmuted. So I just like to, again, thank everyone for your patience. So I'm just going to introduce Flora Giesbrook, who's here for our Q&A. So Flora lives, works, and plays in the Elbow watershed. And for the past 7 years, she's worked for the Elbow River Watershed Partnership as a watershed coordinator. Through her work, Flora understands the importance of protecting fresh water and engaging stakeholders in a collaborative way and helping to share the message that the river is a reflection of the landscape. Flora lives in Bright Creek. When she's not engaged in her work, she's likely found coaching cross-country skiing, mountain biking, or hiking with her family and friends. And Flora also enjoys painting in her spare time. So welcome, Flora. Did you want to share anything just following up Dave's talk before we get to the questions?
Thanks, Amarin. I don't have anything to add. I think there's a good amount of content
I can't hear you, Flora.
Oh.
I can.
You can? Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have any content to add from what Dave covered, but if you'd like, I could take a stab at the first question. I see, what is Calgary doing about the Elbow River? They must be aware. If that's all right, I can.
Perfect.
Just, I'll just talk a little bit about, so the City of Calgary, they have a source water protection plan and riparian policy. So certainly they, I mean, I can't speak on behalf of the City of Calgary, of course, but I can comment on some of the specific goals that they have in their source water protection plan. The first one is, you can tell by the title, protecting the source watershed with improved land use planning, promote innovation in stormwater management to protect source water quality, leverage key partnerships for wildfire management, emergency response, and protecting vulnerable source watershed lands, and involve the community through education and research. That's all I was going to say about that. Dave, this is your presentation, so I'll mute myself.
Oh, no, Flora, keep yourself alive, because there may be other things that I say that you should add, because again, Flora is currently chairman of the, I guess, manager of the Elbow River Watershed Partnership, and she has a long and intimate history with the facts of the river. But yeah, Calgary, one of the things that Calgary is doing is, so for instance, those communities that are supposed to be going in along Highway 8 in Rocky View, Calgary would very much like those communities to tie in to the Calgary water system, so that they then get their drinking water from the Glenmore Reservoir, and then it limits the sewage or the wastewater treatment that goes back into might go back into the Elbow above the Glenmore Reservoir. So if the Rocky View communities can cooperate with the City of Calgary, then the City of Calgary is more assured of having a purer, a more pure water system than what they would have otherwise. So that's one of the things that Calgary is doing. And I believe they also have a contingency plan someone said something about wildfire. They do have a contingency plan in terms of what happens if the water gets polluted from a wildfire, but I don't know if they are fully equipped. I'm not that intimate. I see Renee had a question about the Elbow Provincial Park. So Renee, that park was going to go from the boundary of Kananaskis, just west of Bragg Creek along Highway 66, out all the way to Little Elbow campsite. And the original intent was it was going to include the primary slopes into the Elbow River. And you mentioned something about, would it be a corridor? I mean, I'm not sure that a corridor has the same protection legislation that an actual provincial park does. The idea is that one would want to give it maximum protection in order to keep the water pure and, you know, have proper access to the water rather than just kind of willy-nilly access. So that's what the nature of the Elbow Valley Provincial Park was. And you can read about it in South Saskatchewan, in the appendices to the South Saskatchewan. I see Paula has a question about how I calculated the deforestation. So I use the method that's called point count, where you put a grid on the photograph, and every intersection in that grid that's forested counts as a forested area, and every intersection that's logged is count as a logged area. Now, back in 1984, there was only like 2 patches that were logged in the watershed area. So pretty much I just had to go to the 2016 and count all the dots, all the intersections that fell within the deforested area, the cut area. But I was reminded by my dear friend Ralph Carter that I probably, by dividing that by the total number of forested acres, that's probably not a good thing to do, because much of that land can't be cut because of one reason or another. It's too steep. It's a marshland or it's meadow, and can't be included. So he thinks that my calculation is a conservative calculation relative to the total forested area. So yes, it is. What I did was I counted the areas that are cut versus the forested areas, but the forested areas, which I guess would be the numerator in that fraction, are probably overestimated. I see Justin has how significant is the decreased water quality to Glenmore? Well, I mean, it's a fact, Justin. I mean, you can see from the measurements that the water quality is going down. And I don't know what activities the Calgary or the Calgary Metropolitan Regional District has for trying to keep the water purer upstream, other than what I said before. For any housing developments that go in there, they want to link it into their own context. Is there something you can add to that, Laura? Do you think? I mean,
so certainly forest fire would be the biggest concern for water quality from the City of Calgary's perspective, and anyone downstream of a forest fire. that I believe in the source water protection plan, that's what they've noted as the most significant water quality concern.
Yeah, I don't know what thresholds, Justin, the pollutants have to get to. The other thing that's happening is what a pollutant is being redefined. So there's a bunch of biological pollutants now, like I had alluded to before, for instance, hormones in the water. And then there's other pollutants, other heavy metals that they are increasingly concerned about. But, you know, to what, I don't know what level those pollutants have to rise to trigger a more expensive treatment response in Calgary. But I think Flora and I both know some of the people who are involved in the water treatment there, and they are concerned for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, getting to Jude's question, aside from the answer Amron wants to give on golf courses, but Jude's question, maybe you want to answer this, Flora. Do golf courses have any impact on the Elbow River health?
Okay, sure. I don't have measured statistics with me today on that, but absolutely every use, land use, can have an impact on the health of the Elbow watershed. And based on what I know about, I think there's 9 golf courses in the Elbow watershed, and I believe 8 of them are on the alluvial aquifer. So with that comes risk. So one of the golf courses, in particular the Glencoe Golf and Country Club, they're members of the Audubon Society, and so with that comes extra responsibility. So for example, some of the better management practices that they can do are water conservation, maintaining irrigation equipment, protecting and encouraging wildlife habitats, including conservation of some of their areas and the wetland areas, maximizing turf health through cultural practices to minimize resource inputs, employing integrated pest management techniques, and being careful when handling chemicals, establishing no spray zones. Those are some examples of ways that golf courses can implement better management practices.
I think one of the things about golf courses, in response to Amrit, is it doesn't seem like the Gen Z folks are very interested in golf at all. They would much rather be out riding their mountain bikes somewhere. And as you know, many of the golf courses are now in significant financial difficulty, just because golf's not a thing if you're 20 or 30, not like it was 50 years ago. So I see Bob has a question about what is the stage of the Elbow Valley Provincial Park, and is it just an idea or is there active political lobbying? Well, Bob, I mean, it's kind of beyond an idea thing, but right now, I guess the political lobbying is mostly concerned about keeping coal out of the headwaters and keeping our parks intact, and other seemingly, you know, super important issues like that. The fact that it was included in the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan is a huge thing. Now, a plan is a plan, it's not legislation. But the fact that it's written there gives it political momentum to pick up and move forward. I am hoping that when we can put some energy into not fighting coal, We can transfer some of that energy into the Elbow Valley Provincial Park and get that idea moving forward. We might need a more receptive government for that than the one that we currently had, which of course is more interested in divesting parks as opposed to creating new ones. So political action. You're right. Ultimately, that's it.
I think we have, has that answered question from Paula? Is there any municipality considering having different options for treating wastewater instead of a septic system? Do you have any comment on that, Dave?
Oh,
Paula, we're just at Paula's question, or Flora. I don't know. Do you know anything?
I mean, septic systems are fine if you're not close to if you're far away from the river. If you're more than a kilometer away from the river, and if you're on an acre, right? I mean, the critical problem is when you get a bunch of that overwhelm the subterranean fluvial or aquatic system, and overcome the ability of the ground to purify the water, and then you have to go to a wastewater system of some kind. I know, the city of Calgary was even concerned about Bragg Creek, for Redwood Meadows and Bragg Creek came too. So, so that's an issue. And Redwood Meadows is actually their sewage system is a big concern. That's the one that blew out in 2013 and caused a lot of the pathogens to become present in the mud downstream of Redwood Meadows. I see Justin has a question about McLean Creek. Flora's an expert at siltation in McLean Creek. Flora, do you see Justin's question?
So I'll just read Justin's question there. Regarding McLean OHV silt load to Elbow, what mitigation options are possible? My guess is McLean Pond is a settling pond. Are there any other options?
So some options, what we're learning is that roads crossing, well, a lot of the trails are essentially straight lines. They weren't designed originally as trails. So they might be an old seismic cut line, or maybe an access road for industry. So the problems with straight lines on a curvy landscape is the water will go where there's least path of resistance. And so these trails start acting like creeks and picking up the sediment and bringing them down. So some ways to mitigate siltation into the river would be to design new trails, first of all, find those spots that are the hot spots for sedimentation and try to design like bridge crossings or managing the trails. One of the issues in McLean Creek as well is the signage is not great. So there's a lot of non-designated trails that look like they are actually trails, and some of them lead to creek crossings, and people get lost and confused. And so another way to help mitigate and reduce that compaction and reduce that sedimentation would be making it really obvious which trails are designated and which ones aren't. Those are a couple of ways.
Laura, if I can add to that, Laura's been involved in some work that's really important too in the McLean and Sylvester Creek areas, and that's planting willows to try and stabilize the banks. Willows have great roots and they hold everything in place. And I was reading a study from New Zealand where they planted willows, and the invertebrate population below the willows, once they were planted and in place, exploded, and then the trout came, and you know, it's like one of those Yellowstone Park stories where you put in the wolves and then everything becomes magical, and the ecosystem readjusts itself. So willows along streams, which is cows and water are big proponents of, is one of those kind of magical things that you can do to help restore an ecosystem, a creek ecosystem.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, protecting that really important riparian area, which is so rare. That area of transition between the wet and the dry zones. Planting those willows, they can also help provide shade and cool the waters down, helps the aquatic life catch sediments. Yeah.
Sorry, I just saw that comment from Sarah come up about we need the beavers back. Yeah, absolutely. Beavers are also one of those magical critters that restore an ecosystem to, you know, what it evolved into over millions. And yeah, beavers, yeah, they control the willows. I guess the willows need some kind of control too. Although moose are also pretty good willow control creatures too.
Sure. Did you want to finish up on, we have 2 more questions. I guess we could complete Renee. She, because that was the extension on the beavers, but Renee is asking, why couldn't the Albo Provincial Park proposal include Bragg Creek and Redwood Meadows? That would assist with other issues associated with human overuse.
So it would become some kind of jurisdictional issue. I'm not sure how parks are 1, planned and 2, designated. You know, kind of unfortunately, as we all know, we have to work within the Waters Act, the Parks Act, the Forestry Act, and the various legislative frameworks that are out there. And that, I mean, I think that sounds like a good idea, and it might be possible. I mean, there's parks in the city. I suppose if it's on private land, like some of that land that is between the Bragg Creek Provincial Park and where the Elbow Valley Provincial Park, you just have to outright buy that and get it included in the park system. So, you know, we can, one thing I meant to say, but I didn't say is it's along these lines, is in Europe, in jurisdictions that have been around for hundreds of years and dealt with floods for hundreds of years, like Europe, like Germany, Norway, Switzerland, places that have high topography, temperate climates like us, Japan, they've all gone to room for the river, where essentially that's what they do. They buy out dwellings that are on the floodplain, and they make it into a park. And they let the river, when it floods, they let it flood. That's how it gets rid of its energy onto the adjacent land. That doesn't seem to be that in Eastern Canada, they're actually doing it now along the Ottawa River. It doesn't seem to be something that's very popular in Alberta.
Sure. We've got one last question here, and that's from Jude, and she's asking about the actual, do you think the actual physical weight of the berm will have an impact on the groundwater levels in the hamlet? I think this was suggested as a contributing problem in Exshaw.
I can say something, Flora. Do you want to say anything about that? Yeah.
Definitely not my area of expertise.
Having talked with Kathy Ryan a little bit about this and some of the other hydrologists, Dave Klepacki, I can say that it's not likely that the weight that the compaction is going to be too significant, Jude. The real issue is, I mean, it is true when you look at the measurements. Putting a berm that doesn't go down to bedrock, you know, is not going to stop the ground from going behind the berm. It's just not. You have to have a concrete block that goes right down to bedrock to actually seal off movement of water. Now, depending upon how permeable the stuff underneath the berm is, that is a critical factor. Unfortunately, here in Bragg Creek and in Redwood Meadows, the alluvial aquifer below the berm is extremely permeable. And as we saw in those scientific studies from Redwood and the scientific studies that were done by Jason Aboud and Rito in Roxborough and in the river communities within the valley. So I don't think it's going to be, I don't think the weight is going to be too much. It's interesting what you say about ECHA. I understand the hydrologist who's studying it still hasn't published his results on it. So if you know anything, I would please send me any science you have on it.
So we'll just kind of get things wrapped up here. I just was wondering, Flora, before I just do a closing, if you have anything that you wanted to add. Dave had outlined 4 or 5 points for call to action. I know we've talked as a trio. A lot of our presentations will follow with field trips. We kind of talked briefly with Flora yesterday about inviting her. So we'll do a field trip in the spring after breakup. It's like a day immersion with the Elbow River. So hopefully some of you might be interested in attending that. But do you have any things that you'd like to add as far as way that people can help, and any projects that you have at ERWP that you want people to be aware of, anything that comes to mind?
Okay, sure. Thanks, Emran. So we've been working quite a bit on a report and doing lots of office time. So this year, our plans are to be going outside more. And so, yeah, some walks in the watershed, some weed pulls, some restoration events. If we're successful with a couple of grants, we'll be starting to get volunteers trained in doing benthic surveys, so looking at the invertebrates in the water and following a protocol called Cabin. So those are a few things, yeah, just to encourage everyone to stay engaged. Sometimes I'm asked, there's folks that live in the city and they feel like a lot of these projects are kind of focused on the headwaters and what can they do. And so, yeah, just to Dave's point, conserving water. And one thing that we've noticed in our GIS analysis of the land uses in Calgary, actually the most prominent land cover in Calgary is manicured properties. So there's lots of things you can do with your manicured lands, minimize bare soil and compaction, and encourage native species and planting. Yeah, there's a group, Alberta Land in, I can't remember what it stands for, ALIDP, but they're based out of Calgary and they do a lot of projects
think maybe Flora is frozen, Westbury Creek Wi-Fi. So we'll give Flora a moment, see if she's going to come back. Dave, do you want to just chat to Flora? What we'll do too is on our website under action, in a couple days, we'll have Dave post a summary, and we'll also include any call to actions, including any volunteer, any volunteer positions that they might be looking for with ERWP, if anybody wants to get involved and learn how to do water testing and so on. So we'll make sure that's posted for any of you. You can always approach us and we can direct you as well. We're sad we've lost Flora, so we'll kind of just say thank you in our hearts to Flora. And before we wrap up for the evening, I just want to share about our next event. This next event is Rescue and Return to the Wild, and it's with the Cochrane Ecological Institute, and it's on March 26th. So it's coming up in 2 weeks. We slid them in as it is a fundraiser. And this is with Cleo Smeaton and Ken Weigel. And they've been running the Cochrane Ecological Institute for 50 years. And so they're going to be just talking about the importance of rewilding and rehabilitating. And what the present bylaws are around rehabilitation and orphan animals. It's they're absolutely amazing people. Cleo just turned 80 in March. She's just so inspirational and full of life. And so $15 from every ticket sold will be donated to CEI. And what's really exciting too is on May 2nd, our field trip, we're going to be heading out to CEI. There'll be 3 different walks. So one walk is in the afternoon, it's just a tour of CEI. And then we're going to be combining nature therapy walks with me, and then a tour of the facility. And then we'll just reverse that, and those will include lunch as well. So we're hoping to raise some good money for them. So watch out for that, and I hope you'll join us. And I think that's it, unless anyone has any other questions. We'll wrap up for the evening with a really big thank you. And let's see if there's anything else come up here, but I see one more. Thank you. Perfect. Ready to wrap up? Dave?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cheers. This is Elbow River water. Cheers to the Elbow River.
Yay. Well, thanks everybody, and have a great evening. Thanks so much for joining us.
And thank you, Amron, for all your Zoom wizardry.
I don't know about that, but thanks, Dave.
Take care.
Okay, take care, everybody. Have a good night. See you soon.